podcast made by, for, and about Beatles fans. And now, here's your host, Alexanian.
All right, hello. Welcome back to Fans on the Run, my favorite Beatles podcast. I'm not being biased or anything. Who am I kidding? Yes, I am. Even after this hiatus, I'm still at a loss for how to introduce the show. Again, I'm always taking suggestions at fansontheRunpodcast@gmail.com. But enough of my aimless meandering. We have a great guest for you today. He's the author of the Let It Be installment of the 33 1/3 series, the Bob Dylan biography Dylan, and he's written for the New York Times, Rolling Stone, Spin, and the LA Times. Please give a warm welcome to Steve Matteo. Steve, welcome to Fans on the Run.
Thanks, Ethan. It's great to be here.
So, I'd like to kick things off these days with a non-Beatles question. What other music are you listening to?
Well, it's funny because I find myself keep getting deeper and deeper into that time period with the Beatles in the 60s, but specifically very much mid-60s sort of British music. The Rolling Stones, the Kinks, the Who, the Yardbirds, the British Invasion acts, Jerry and the Pacemakers, Dave Clark 5, Petula Clark, Lulu. I just can't seem to get away from it. I find myself getting deeper and deeper into it. I don't know.
Bands that, maybe weren't as popular. I've been on a major Yardbirds kick for the past few months too.
I love the Yardbirds.
The only bigger kick I've been on is a Hollies kick.
I love the Hollies. It's what's great too is, I've interviewed Graham Nash. I've interviewed Jeff Beck. I've had a chance to interview these people, and it's amazing.
Incredible. So, why not? What was Graham Nash like?
Well, it's funny because I've actually interviewed him a number of times, and he's one of those people who he's always really nice, and he doesn't just treat you like, oh, this is just another interview. He works very hard at it. I get a sense from Graham that he doesn't take his career for granted. I think the British musicians of that period, they grew up, it was hard. They grew up just after the war. Yeah. The war came to England. It didn't come to the United States, World War II. So he's very thankful of what he was able to accomplish. It's funny because most of the times that I interviewed him, it was really more about Crosby, Stills, and Nash. But then I interviewed him when he put out his autobiography, and we had a chance to get a bit more into depth, talking about the Hollies. And I love the Hollies because I love vocal harmony. That's one of my absolute, favorite things about, pop music.
It's almost sacrilege, but I've said on this show before, and I'll say it again, the Hollies had better harmonies than the Beatles.
You could definitely say that. I love, the Everly Brothers, the Beach Boys, the Hollies. I just love, when you get siblings singing together. The early Bee Gees, the albums that they did in the 60s.
Can't beat 'em.
There's just nothing like that music. The vocal blend is just extraordinary. So, I love that. I just love that whole period. Liverpool, London, Manchester, Birmingham. It's just so rich.
You mentioned interviewing. I want to ask, what has there been an interview that's made you the most starstruck?
It's funny because when I do interviews, the only thing I ever really worry about is my tape recorder failing. Which has happened a couple of times. Like, I'm never really like nervous or, whatever. I mean, there are certain interviews that have really, that have stood out, certainly. But I always feel very comfortable because I love music. And so I'm talking about music. I mean, unless the person is sort of, they're difficult. But, most of the time, people have been, they've been great. And it's funny because it almost seems sometimes like the bigger the star, the most famous or the greater artist, musician are the easiest to talk to. They're the nicest people. And I interviewed Tony Bennett, and he was just amazing. Quincy Jones was another person. It reached a point in the interview with Quincy where he was interviewing me, basically.
Really?
More or less, Jones. It seemed. Yeah. Paul Simon was another person I interviewed who was just so relaxed and like no handlers around, and he wasn't going anywhere. I mean, he was just gonna hang out and talk. And so, I mean, I could go on, but I mean, I've been pretty lucky. The circumstance, and again, my fear of my tape recorder not working is more the sort of thing that would create anxiety, than anything else.
And now I think it's a good point in the show. Well, it's not even a point in the show. We're still starting the show. Oh, God, I do not have a way with words. We go back to the beginning. Steve, how did you first discover the Beatles?
I mean, I'm of a certain age where, I was a child when they just started. I mean, I don't think I remember exactly, say, when they were on Ed Sullivan. I think I was probably too young. But I can remember them, being on the radio and having older cousins who had the records or like the fan magazines. I could distinctly remember that. So it's a little hazy in the beginning, like the very, very beginning. I mean, I can remember somebody's older brother having Sergeant Pepper. I think where I really started to really be really cognizant of the Beatles, quote unquote, was at the end in some respects, when Let It Be was coming out and they were breaking up, But I mean, they were always there. I mean, you're just kind of a child. I mean, I grew up in New York, so we had WABC AM. And I mean, so they just played the Beatles all the time. And that was so much a part of that, listening to the radio, in the back seat of the family car or having a transistor radio. So yes, I am old,
You're only as old as you feel.
Right.
What is your earliest memory of the Beatles?
I mean, it's just probably like, Eleanor Rigby. I mean, because I can distinctly remember being with these sort of older cousins who had the fan magazine with the lyrics of the song and like reading along to the lyrics, it's just like you're reading this and it's, you're like, what, however old I was, 8 years old, whatever. It's not totally making sense to me, but it's, there's no context for it at that age. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You're just a kid and you're just lucky enough to have been, of an age where, the Beatles AM hits singles were on the radio,
And so you said you really finally became cognizant towards the end. How did your love of the Beatles go from there?
I mean, it's funny because I think that, after they broke up, then the solo albums would come out. So you were sort of, learning more about them and discovering more about them, as All Things Must Pass comes out, as the McCartney album comes out, as Imagine comes out, as It Don't Come Easy is coming out, and it's just part of the sort of the education, before you really understand again the sort of, the sort of, context of it, and the importance of it. You don't really learn that till later, Yeah. So you're just listening, and you're just like a sponge. And, I can remember getting my first own sort of real stereo when the Concert for Bangladesh triple album set was being released, and they were playing it, like all the way through on the radio, which obviously you can't do today, because of the, because of the digital, copyright act, whatever it's called, So that's kind of where I sort of come in, where you really are starting to get like, this stuff is important, I can, remember listening to Bangladesh, and it's like, George Harrison and Ringo Starr and, Billy Preston and Leon Russell. And it's like, wow, this is pretty amazing, and it's like live music, you're hearing live music. And I had not been to a concert at that point. And, that's 2 or 3 years down the road, So, that's kind of like, that's a tipping point for me,
It's always a milestone in a Beatle fan's getting their first book. What was the first Beatle book you remember?
That's tough, because I know that I started reading about music like really intently when I think it was one of the first Doors biographies came out. I think it was the No One Here Gets Out Alive one, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay.
So that would be, I'm probably just out of high school at that point. I don't remember necessarily reading music books that closely in high school, but I can't say for sure. I mean, I think the first books that really stand out that have like a real impression on me are probably like, the Hunter Davies authorized biography.
Yeah.
That might have been the first ones, but there's probably other books that I'm not remembering.
There was
clearly
the Nick Schaffner Beatles Forever one in the 70s.
Yeah, that one maybe came before. It's hard to tell, but yeah, that the Schaffner book is definitely, one of my favorite early memories of reading a Beatles book. I love that book, but there are mistakes in that book. There are definitely errors of fact, but the passion and the love and the knowledge is there. There's no question about it. And it's a beautiful book too.
And so, well, this is kind of a sad question, but do you remember where you were when you heard that John Lennon had died?
Yes, I was at a girlfriend's apartment, and we were watching Monday Night Football. And, so that's how the news was delivered. And again, I think sometimes when these things happen, I think that the sort of gravity of it is, it's stunning, and it's earth shaking, but you're sort of trying to you're living your life, and you're young. And I think, what do they say? Youth is wasted on the young. I think that, you're just sort of, the maturity level is not there enough to really sort of grasp, the whole thing as it's happening. It's funny, because I always find that time period is, it's a real sea change, because, John was assassinated literally within weeks of Ronald Reagan being elected president, Mm-hmm. So this is really a sea change, And I don't think we're really aware of AIDS yet at that point. So this is, people say there's so many times that the 60s sort of ended.
Yeah.
It kind of ended, it ended obviously at the end of the 60s. It ended when the Beatles broke up, or, some people say, well, it ended when when we pulled out of Vietnam, or when the draft ended in 73.
At Altamont.
Or Altamont, or, when the Manson murders happened, when Woodstock, so to me, really, I think the '60s really ended when Ronald Reagan was elected and John Lennon was assassinated, which were within a few weeks of each other. It's so interesting because that period from when Kennedy is assassinated and the Beatles appear on Ed Sullivan is only what, not 6 weeks or something like that. And then the period from when Reagan is elected and Lennon is assassinated is within like weeks. It's a month, maybe, it's maybe a month. So it's interesting how those two things are kind of almost like bookend each other in some ways,
I think it speaks to how prolific or how important the 60s were, that they managed to somehow continue until John Lennon died.
Yeah. I mean, the 70s are this definite continuation of everything about the 60s. You know what I mean? So, I mean, look, I think when the punk thing happens, there's certainly a change. I mean, there's definitely a change comes around, when the Sex Pistols come around and the Ramones and, Patti Smith, television, some of this was already happening with Iggy Pop, when he was in the Stooges and, the MC5 and the sort of downtown New York scene is kind of happening before punk, before that, before the musical aspect of it, just like the swinging 60s, just like before the Beatles, you had in London, you had, Mary Quant and, David Bailey and, David Hockney, and you had art and photography and fashion, already happening before the music is happening,
It's just the music happened to fall into place.
The music sort of becomes the soundtrack. But I think the music sort of partially comes out of that, it just, because the music is a sort of popular exponent of this stuff happening, where in some respects, the photography and the fashion, and especially the art, is more sort of underground. And when I say art, I mean, obviously visual art and photography. That stuff is more of sort of the underground kind of cutting edge, where the music becomes sort of the popularization that's, reaching a wide variety of people, especially young people, very young people in terms of pop music, where, it's, really, really, teens and preteens,
Mm-hmm. Well, now I kind of want to start asking about the, Let It Be book, which, you were gracious enough to send me. I should say that. But it's I never really delved that deep into the Get Back sessions. I always knew little bits and pieces, and I'm sure we're going to find out a lot more later this year with all the with the Peter Jackson and the new Get Back book. But as I was reading, I was coming up with some questions. Would you say that the Beatle inner circle was frustrated with the transition from NEMS to Apple, even like pre-Alan Klein?
I mean, like everything with the Beatles in terms of the end and Let It Be and Abbey Road and all of that. And this stuff had been festering for a long time. I mean, if you go back to when the Beatles are leaving Candlestick Park in a helicopter, George Harrison basically said, that's it. The Beatles are over. That's kind of it. I mean, obviously that isn't the case. I mean, Revolver was already finished. And they would do what would be their most important album, which is Sgt. Pepper, and of course we would still get Abbey Road and a lot of the music that was collected on Magical Mystery Tour and the White Album, so it's not over. I mean, their best single would not come out till '68, which is Hey Jude, in my opinion. So. I mean, after Brian dies, after Sgt. Pepper, I mean, I think that's the biggest sort of mark that begins the sort of slow. It's a slow death.
Yeah.
thankfully. Look, everything has a peak. Neil Young said every wave is new until it breaks. So there's different periods where they sort of, it's like a marriage or any kind of relationship. There's always going to be peaks and valleys. Some relationships do end. Some end quickly. Some take a long time to end. Rock bands are very volatile. They're very volatile sort of things. And the Beatles are the biggest rock band that ever existed in the eye of the storm of the 60s in London, and obviously Liverpool before that. So, it's an age thing too. I mean, they started out, very, very young. And, they grew up in the Beatles, and at the different points, obviously they got married and had children and, moved on, So, it's just that, Abbey Road and Let It Be mark the end. But once Brian died, that was coming anyway, because who knows if, Brian's contract was coming due that summer. So who knows if they would have continued on with him or what his involvement would have been. They were taking over more and more of the sort of, stuff that Brian was doing anyway. I mean, the big change is when Klein comes in, because Klein cleans house at that point. Once Alan Klein comes along, he
fires like Alistair Taylor
and I mean, this goes on. I mean, this bleeding goes on, for the longest time. I mean, there's very few people who sort of still remain. I mean, I guess it's really Neil Aspinall really is the person who sort of stuck it out the longest and went on to run Apple until his death. So I try not to focus too much, on the sort of end and the sort of all the kind of business machinations. I mean, Apple to the Core, I think, covers a lot of that. And there's one other book, and I'm forgetting the name of it, or a more recent book that's
You Never Give Me Your Money.
Right. That sort of cover, like, to me, a lot of that stuff, it leaves me a little cold. I'm not a math person. I'm not a numbers person. I'm whichever side of the brain is, not that, So a lot of that stuff is just like, it's like watching paint dry. I mean, some people are fascinated by that stuff. And I think if it's presented in the right way, I think it can be very interesting. And it adds another layer of context and subtext to the story of the Beatles, because it is significant. But I would rather read.
I find the business end of things towards the end with Apple a really interesting kind of psychological profile.
Right. The way that Richard DeLillo covers it in the Last Cocktail Party, where I think he weaves it in and out with his own kind of personal story and gives you a lot of insight into the day by day and the various characters. But when it's just sort of a rendering of the sort of, nuts and bolts of it all, it's just like, oh my God, it's just, you realize why these bands break up. It's almost inevitable. You know what it is? It's just so much money involved.
Yeah.
And there's people who are involved in it who that's all, the only reason they're there is because of the money aspect of it, or the fame or the power aspect of it. I'm more interested in the music. How do they write the songs? How do they make the music? That kind of thing is more interesting to me. Where do they hang out? Who do they hang out with? What books do they read? Where do they go on holiday? That stuff is more interesting to me,
Well, I have a bit of a general question. Where do you think the general consensus of the Get Back, Let It Be sessions being so miserable come from?
I mean, the way the original film is cut, it's very sort of, dark kind of, it's a little disjointed. It kind of before the climax, there's definitely this kind of sort of claustrophobic sort of, these guys are just kind of maybe not getting along so well. Having said all that, I'm a fan of Michael Lindsay Hogg. I interviewed him for my Let It Be book. He's a great guy. He's done a lot of amazing stuff in music and out of music, and he's a unique person. He's a really interesting guy. He's an artist. He's very, very self-effacing, very mild-mannered. He has a very important impact on sort of the evolution of music on television, music videos.
Well, he was one of the main people behind Ready, Steady, Go.
Yes. Yeah. And so I think it becomes sort of this critical mass of like, well, Rolling Stone said it's, a depressing movie, so we're all supposed to hate it.
Yeah.
Because they were like, the be all end all rock Bible there for the longest time. I'm sure that, the others around at that time, Cream and Crawdaddy and, whoever else also hated it. And so therefore that, it becomes this, there's definitely this pack mentality with the music press, particularly back then. It was so small and very sort of insular and very sort of East Coast. Rolling Stone, was, didn't move out to the West Coast. I'm sorry, Rolling Stone went backwards. I mean, they were sort of out West, but a lot of the people that wrote for them were in New York too. Or it was more of a sort of San Francisco take on things, rather than the sort of Southern California thing. So, when I did the book, and this is long before the whole Peter Jackson thing, when I did the book, it was clear to me from the people that I spoke with that it wasn't all this depressing sort of thing. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. That there was a lot of really funny stuff. I say in the book, I believe that, there's people that said that, John would just literally walk in a room and people would fall on the floor laughing because he was such a cut up, So, I hope they don't just do a whitewash with this new documentary that's coming out.
That's what I'm worried about.
But it would be nice to kind of see the other side that there was. I mean, look, some of this is revisionism. It's like with the Let It Be Naked. It's very much sort of taking the Let It Be album and sort of now creating something different with it, which I don't, that's fine. I like.
How do you feel about Let It Be Naked? I
mean, when you listen to it, it is kind of all cleaned up and it has this nice flow and it's like a real album. And, so yeah, that's great. On the other hand, all the little snippets and stuff is, how I know it and how I grew up with it. And it's part of the charm of it, this sort of cinema verite, fly on the wall kind of thing. Now, the fly on the wall disc was a major missed opportunity because you're just getting little segments of things, which, to me, what they should have done, and hopefully they will do, is first of all, they should have the entire rooftop concert on a disc, vinyl and CD.
I'd buy the hell out of that.
They should also have at least one, if not two discs of all the sort of best takes of covers that they did of other people's material, of songs that would go on to be on, Abbey Road, on solo albums. How much of that they can do now, though, at this point, because they've already done, a White Album and an Abbey Road expanded versions, and because they've already done some expanded versions of some of the solo albums, I don't know how they're going to do that.
Well, there's 96 hours of Nagra reel tape.
Yeah, but a lot of that, I think some of the best of that now, we have heard some of the best of that because of the Abbey Road expanded edition, even the White Album to some degree expanded edition, whatever some of the solo stuff. I mean, there's going to be a conflict between, we don't know what Harrison his estate is going to do. There's going to be a new All Things Must Pass. We don't know what's going to be done with that. There was so much stuff that went on, during the time of the Beatles, of George's stuff that ends up on All Things Must Pass and even later releases. I mean, we go pretty far down the road where George is still sort of redoing things that he did while he was in the Beatles.
Like Not Guilty in 78.
Right. So, but this is great. This is fun. I mean, the fact that there's still things that they can find to put out. I welcome these reissues. I know that a lot of the bootleg community, they shrug their shoulders because they've been listening to this stuff for 20, 30, 40 years.
They have their A, B roads and their 83 disc sets.
Right. And God bless them, and I love all that, it's fun, all that bootleg stuff, especially when they sort of like almost create their own albums and the packaging and the liner notes. And I'm a sucker for that stuff. I'm not a bootleg buyer. I never was. But people have been kind over the years to gift me with some of this material. And it's endlessly fascinating. It just, to me, there's no bottom, I love it, and it's done with love. I believe a lot of these bootleggers over the years, they haven't done it to get rich.
No.
I mean, they do it for the love. And I mean, now most of what they do is they don't even sell this stuff. They just kind of all trade CDRs or whatever. They don't do that anymore. It's all just fun. It's a community,
At this point, it's mostly people on forums just sharing them with people.
Right, exactly.
For free.
Right. Which is the way it should be.
Exactly. And funny enough, one of the questions I was going to ask you is, how important are the bootlegs out there in telling the story of these sessions?
I mean, I think it's really important because there's so much of the information and the actual music that will never be officially released, because they're music companies and they're not just going to put every last note out there, because I think they are trying to give, people some, somewhat, of a kind of value product, I mean, it's not, King Crimson where, they put out, and, look, if I had the money, I would buy that King Crimson set. I would love to.
So would I.
Yeah.
And then Robert Fripp would be very happy with both of us.
Right. And, I'm not, King Crimson is not one of my favorite groups of all time, but I particularly love the really early Crimson, especially the first couple of albums.
Like the ones with Greg Blake.
Right. I was a fan of Fripp when he went off and did things with, David Byrne and David Bowie and Brian Eno. And, I saw Robert Fripp perform live during, that period, which was really amazing to have seen that, let me tell you. So, they've just put out now a John Mayall 35 CD
I saw that.
box set, which again,
God.
I mean, I would love to, I cannot afford that. I would love, and the record company's not going to send it to me. I mean, I've got a lot of that music. I think I've got everything that Mayall's ever done because I'm a Mayall fan, and I'm fascinated by the Blues Breakers and, all the people who sort of come out of, the Blues Breakers, Peter Green and Mick Taylor and Eric Clapton and the Mark Allman Band, and, the list is kind of endless,
There's something you mention in the book that, and you actually mentioned it fairly early on, and you mention a 2004 DVD release of Let It Be.
Well, there was supposed to be one. That was when I was interviewing people like Michael Lindsay Hogg for the book. He said, yeah, there's going to be a release. And they interviewed me for extra material and blah, blah, blah. And, it never happened. My guess is that after George died, I think there was a sense of reviving the project because I think of all of them, I think George hated it the most. And so I think that they were going to eventually put it out. Now, I don't know why it was not put out, what the reason is. But it went on the back burner again. I mean, it's just, it's one of the, it's so funny that this whole Peter Jackson movie has been delayed, several times because of the pandemic. It's almost like this project is cursed.
It's on
Now,
brand.
you have to right. You have to remember too that, Michael Lindsay Hogg did the Rolling Stones Rock and Roll Circus, before Let It Be. And that was shelved for years because the Stones were like one of the last ones to come on and perform at like 5:00 in the morning. And Mick felt that their performance was really lackluster because they were up for so many hours and because they felt some of the other performers, particularly obviously The Who, were so much better. So poor Michael Lindsay Hogg.
Guy can't get a released major music film out there.
Right. Well, they did put it out on VHS, if you remember. And I believe, was it ever put out on Laserdisc?
Let It Be?
Yeah. I don't remember. I always forget this.
Let It Be, I think, was on Laserdisc,
right.
VHS, and Betamax.
Betamax, okay. But it never came out on DVD, and it's never been released on Blu-ray. The Beatles anthology has never come out on Blu-ray, which is kind of amazing. I mean, it originally came out on VHS and then very quickly came out on DVD.
Well, it makes sense why anthology wouldn't be on Blu-ray, though.
And why not?
Well, because I'm sure a lot of those interviews were filmed in the 90s on videotape, which can't really be upscaled to 1080p or 4K or what have you.
I'm sorry, my phone is ringing. I was going to unplug it and I completely forgot. I apologize.
No worries.
It just sounds more real. So you know what? It's Michael Lindsay Hogg.
Yes.
And his ears are burning, and he heard us talking, and so he's going to correct us on all that we've talked about.
Is this the first Fans on the Run call-in?
So I think there are ways to fix all that stuff because I wrote about the recent. What was it? The Pink Floyd, The Delicate Sound of Thunder, which has been redone. And I think there are ways to take all that stuff and upscale it and whatever these kids do to make this stuff look good and make it widescreen on a Blu-ray. So I think there are ways to do that.
And even though it may not look the best, I do see Apple in the future reissuing the anthology on Blu-ray.
Yeah, they'll do it. I don't think there's any question about it. It'll happen.
There are some things with the Beatles stuff that, it's just a matter of time before they do it. Like they will put out the Shea Stadium stuff. Like, because
I would think so, but you never know because
the legal situation.
That's a weird one.
I thought was resolved after the 8 Days a Week film. Like the Beatles ended up just buying the rights.
I don't think it's strictly a legal thing. Most, if not, I don't know how much what the actual percentage is, but a good deal of the Shea Stadium, the audio of it it's not the concert. It's, because it was poorly recorded because it was so loud. And at that time, they didn't have the kind of equipment to properly record something like that. And their level of live musicianship at that point, and everybody knows this, was not, the best. Yeah.
But at that point, I'm not even terribly worried about that because, there are tons of live Beatles recordings and high quality. If you're watching the Shea Stadium, you're most likely watching it. Like, you want to see the Beatles in this, giant stadium full of people, this iconic event.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah. And I feel like the audio might even take a bit of a back seat to that.
I'm sure that they can fix it. I'm sure there's ways to, again, they can do things, like when they did the Hollywood Bowl, they really were able to fix that and clean it up. Now, of course, Hollywood Bowl was a much smaller, more, acoustic sort of venue. It's a place for music. There's no question about it. I was able to interview Giles Martin when that was put out for an article that I did. And maybe they can use some of that equipment. But I think more of the problem with the Hollywood Bowl was was the screaming. Where I think with the Shea Stadium, it was bigger. The problems were bigger than that.
It just was not recorded well.
Right, because the Shea Stadium is this huge baseball stadium that can seat 55,000 people, where the Hollywood Bowl is probably, I don't know, maybe 10, 15,000. And it was a proper stage. It's more of an acoustic venue, a properly acoustic venue.
Actually, what's a potential release that you'd like to see out of the Beatles camp? Like if you went to Apple and you had veto power, what's the thing you would want put out?
I just think there's so much. It's all, you can see it on YouTube. There's so much more live stuff beyond the 8 Days a Week movie. There's just so much. I mean, to me, I think they should put it all out. I think anything that's of the Beatles that is even marginally good audio quality, it should be put out. If it's marginally good audio and video, it should be put out. I mean, you have full concerts. Okay, I know some of these concerts are, they're only 20 or 30 minutes. And some of them repeat. But I mean, you know what I'm talking about. Yeah. You've seen some of this stuff. Some of it is just, it's the sound is fine. And the visuals are beautiful. Yeah. Some of the stuff in color. The Festival
Hall stuff in Australia. They remastered it last year, and it's beautiful.
I would love to see all of that. Everything that they can find that was done on television that still exists, that is still, that is available wherever. Yeah. I mean, I know some things have been wiped through the years. They weren't kept through no fault of the Beatles or Brian Epstein.
Yeah.
But I mean, I would just, all of that, I would love to be able to just sit down, for 3 hours or 4 hours. And, I love the Ron Howard movie, but I almost think that what they should do is there should be like a companion to it that's just the music.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And nothing else.
No interviews, no Whoopi Goldberg.
Yeah. I mean, I don't want to see that stuff go away, but I just think there should be two separate, because it's so exciting, for whatever shows may occasionally lack in a level of musicianship or sound quality. There's an electricity and an excitement to see that and witness that. There's very few things more thrilling in life than seeing that stuff. I mean, the whole Washington concert should be available.
I think entire it is concert. Digitally.
All right. Well, it should be. You should be able to go on Amazon and click, and they send the Blu-ray to your house legally.
I agree.
I mean, I don't know if I'm answering your question completely, because I know that when we're done with this, I'm going to think of other things that that I would like to see. So
they could even do like a collector's choice series, like the Washington, the Budokan, Festival Hall, Shea, and pick maybe like a dozen or half a dozen.
Right, you don't have to buy them all.
Yeah,
and of course the people like us and all the Beatles peoples, as I call them, they're going to buy them all.
Yeah, that's just who we are.
You or I are not going to just buy. 3, however many they put out, we're just gonna buy them all. And I think when they're on Blu-ray like that, I think it's great, because when you can have friends over and you can just put it on, it's very easy. I'm always amazed by people. Well, I don't have a Blu-ray player. Really? Do you have a toaster? I mean, Blu-ray players are. You can get a state-of-the-art Blu-ray player probably for like $150.
Probably. I've spent the past few years upgrading my Beatles DVD collection over to Blu-ray. So, the Criterion, Hard Day's Night, and all that stuff.
Wow, that's great stuff.
And so now I like to ask the biggest, broadest question of the show. What do the Beatles mean to you? and how have they changed your life?
I think it's been a thing that's evolved over the years. I think I've always loved the Beatles. I guess I didn't realize they were my favorite group of all time until later in life. I think that, again, it's like an evolving thing. I think the big sort of change came was when I wrote the Let It Be book. I was, prior to that, I was getting more and more into them, where I was, getting more books about them and trying to learn more about them. And, I could always remember, when you're kind of hanging out, when you're at that age, when you're, out of high school or even out of college and hanging out with people and like listening to the White Album, it's like this fun thing. And, but I think even before the book, because I was writing about, Beatles related stuff in terms of my journalism before I did the book, So I think it's just this always evolving thing, I think there were times when, maybe sort of in the 80s, it was sort of like, it was almost like a little bit of a sense of like, well, that's kind of the past, and I'm now into all this new music. And, when you're in college and you're in your 20s, and I was listening to whatever the music was of that time. And being somebody who was a music journalist, most of what I was writing about was new music, So writing about sort of reissues and music from the past doesn't really start to become a big thing until the sort of CD age, and they start reissuing everything on CD. So all of this old music starts getting a new life, and it becomes like history. After John died, I think there was this sort of going back to the Beatles and going back to John and trying to understand more of the history of it. You'd get books like, the Peter Brown book.
You Never Give Me Your Money.
Right.
Oh wait, no, The Love You Make.
The Love You Make becomes like, oh yeah, right. All this stuff happened. I think in the late 80s, I think that there's this sort of backlash to the kind of 80s and yuppies and, all of that synthesizer, horrible music. And I think people start, really discovering the 60s again, and kind of in the mid to late 80s. Mm-hmm. I think that's where it kind of begins.
But you can even hear it in the music of the 80s. Paisley Underground. Right.
Yeah, I think the sort of punk new wave thing, a lot of that was very much like Another British Invasion. Nick Lowe and Elvis Costello, to me were really like, oh, this is like another British invasion. This is like, you become fascinated again with sort of British music and British culture in London. And I remember listening to the ska bands, the Specials, and that felt very 60s to me. Mm-hmm. It was really good music. It had a little bit of a kind of feel for that. It had a style. So partially through new music too, you become kind of, reinterested in that age again, and fascinated by it.
Yeah. Well, here's I think I've said my favorite part of the show like 6 times. This is actually my favorite part of the show. I call these the quick-fire questions, even though the answers are almost always not quick. What is your favorite Beatles song?
Hey Jude. I mean, there's no question about it. I mean,
Why Hey
I
Jude?
think that's it's perfect. It's just, I don't know. That song, I don't know, the way it makes me feel. I mean, I think a lot of people will, pick that. I think that was the song that was number 1 for the longest on the charts of anything they did. It just, I don't know. I've seen Paul perform it, and it is like, it's an amazing moment. It is like that,
when
the
everyone
whole
has their
ending of
flashlights on and
right.
an entire arena is just singing. Da,
right.
da, da.
From beginning, that great cold opening to that long fade. I mean, it's just, he's such an extraordinary songwriter. It's just, I don't know. What can you say? I'm not a fan of people that trash Paul McCartney. He just, I love him. He's just extraordinary. The songs that he's written, you can take an album that would be considered not one of the best Beatle albums, like Let It Be, and think of the songs of his that are on that album. Let It Be, Get Back, The Long and Winding Road. I mean, the ability to write songs is just his sense of melody, his sense of, structuring music, writing a song. It's just, there's not too many people that can touch him, and I love the solo stuff, and I loved Wings, so Hey Jude is my favorite. I think maybe after that it would be While My Guitar Gently Weeps. I think I might pick that number 2.
On the flip side of that question, what's your least favorite Beatles song?
There's probably songs that will come on the radio that I'm sort of like, I don't want to really hear that, or I don't need to hear that. I mean, most of them are probably more of the sort of earlier things. The cover songs are not really my favorites. I'd rather hear Beatles songs written by the Beatles. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like rock and roll music to me is sort of like, I get it. Okay. Not one of my favorites.
So if you hear rock and roll music on the radio, you'll be like, not for me today.
I don't know if I would turn it off, but I don't think I would consider it one of my favorites. There really is not a bad Beatles song. Like I love, You Know My Name, Look Up the Number. I know people will pick that as like, oh my God.
That song's
it's
a
awful.
riot. It's awesome.
I love that. Even Revolution number 9. It has a place. It is significant. The White Album is not the White Album without that track. Mm-hmm. Okay. So I'm not going to go to listen to it.
Because of all the weirdness.
Right. I'm not going to go and say, wow, I really think I'm going to want to go listen to Revolution number 9 right now. But I would never take that off of the White Album.
Kind of on a similar vein, what is your favorite Beatles album?
I mean, here's how I'll answer the question. Okay. I think that Beatles for Sale and Magical Mystery Tour, obviously the U.S. Magical Mystery Tour, are the 2 most underrated albums, especially Magical Mystery Tour. Okay.
Hell yeah.
I think that the most technically advanced album of the Beatles, where the Beatles had taken the Beatles as far as they could, is Abbey Road. Only because it's the last album that they recorded. Okay. Their most important album is Sgt. Pepper. I don't think there's any question about it. I don't think anybody would argue that. I think their best album is Revolver.
Yes.
I think that's the best Beatles album.
There's a running joke on this show that there's a secret correct answer to that question. And you got it right. It's Revolver.
Okay, good. I win. My favorite album is the White Album. I think that's a lot of people will pick that one because it's 2 albums of Beatles songs, mm-hmm. and it's just fun. It's like the family album.
Yeah.
It's like you pick up the family album and you page through it.
That album is the Beatles in 1968, warts and all.
It's so much fun. It's just a lot of fun. It's like a Rorschach. Test.
There's Piggies. Why don't we do it in the road? Don't pass me by. All these, offbeat.
You can never get tired of the White Album. How many double albums can you listen all the way through? I mean, Electric Ladyland, Blonde on Blonde, Wheels of Fire, which is actually some of that is live. Actually, the Allman Brothers live at the Fillmore East. The first Chicago album. It's London Calling, The Clash. I'll throw one album not from the 60s or early 70s in there.
That's actually a tough one. Now I'm thinking, what's a double album I can listen the whole way through?
Yeah, it's it's not something that you do a lot, to sit down and listen to 2 albums all the way through. There's always going to be tracks that are, not the best or filler or just little sketches or, whatever the case may be,
Yeah. And I have a feeling you saw this coming. The flip side to this question: what is your least favorite Beatles album?
I mean, it's probably one of the early Capitol albums.
Yeah.
I mean, some of those albums are they're kind of lightweight, they're just kind of like, they have maybe too many covers on them. I mean, some people think the Beatles' second album is one of their best albums because it's such a great rock and roll album.
I think the Beatles' second album's great, but some of those, people love to praise Meet the Beatles, but I feel like it's actually kind of a weak album.
It's, I find having a discussion about something about the Beatles that isn't good, not something I could spend much time on.
Well, luckily for you, we're starting to wind up here. The last question I'll ask you: when you listen to Let It Be, do you prefer the Phil Spector, the Let It Be Naked, or the Glyn Johns?
I mean, it's all interesting to me. I grew up with the Phil Spector, one. I'm one of those people who, I'm a huge Phil Spector fan. I love The Wall of Sound. That music, the Ronettes, the Phil Spector Christmas album. I mean, to me, the Phil Spector Christmas album is one of the best albums ever made.
Agreed.
Period. Okay. My favorite album of all time, I don't know if are you going to ask me that question?
No, but you can answer.
Okay. Well, it's produced by Phil Spector. It's All Things Must Pass. So I love Phil Spector. Don't forget, Phil produced some of John's stuff there's no Wall of Sound on that stuff. I know Instant Karma's got sort of the kind of Wall of Sound thing, but, he's a lot more versatile than people think. I love The Long and Winding Road the way it is. I know Paul hates it, and that's, his prerogative. I'm amazed that there wasn't some way for him to stop it, When you see Paul perform, and he does The Long and Winding Road, okay, they don't do it with strings and a choir, obviously, but it has the feel of the Spector Let It Be version.
Yeah.
So now maybe he's doing that because he wants the fans to get the experience that's the closest to what they grew up listening to on the record, but I don't know. I like it all.
Yeah.
I think I prefer the original album. I think that's, I think it's just, that's what I grew up with. I love the sort of the silliest sides and all that kind of thing. I mean, once you get into the weeds with it, you realize that it isn't as spontaneous, obviously, as it sounds, where they're taking little bits and pieces from little different places and putting them in, I haven't listened to the Glyn Johns enough to really have an opinion on it. I tried to interview Glyn for my book, and I wasn't able to get an interview with him. I would love to interview him. He's one of the greatest record producers. I mean, the stuff that he's done, with the Rolling Stones and with the Eagles. I mean, the list is sort of endless. Right. I mean, the stuff that he did at Olympic. I mean, he was like the guy at Olympic Records, which is the other great recording studio, really, if you think about it.
Yeah.
In England, that made, where rock records were made. Obviously the first, particularly the first place where Olympic was, the first location, So it's all out there for everybody to listen to. Everybody has their own opinion. I'm not one of those music critics who even considers himself a critic who likes to sort of foist his opinion on other people. I'm much more interested in this sort of journalism, this sort of like documenting things, and then people can decide for themselves what they like and what they don't like, or what they believe is true or what they believe isn't true. Or, I'm not here to sort of, say you have to listen to this or you have to listen to that, or if you like this, you're wrong. I'm not a fan of that.
Well, neither am I. Yeah, I'll edit out the silence.
That's okay.
But yeah, so where can people find you and your books?
Well, I don't have a website. I'm probably the only person left in America who doesn't have a website. But
If it makes you feel any better, I don't have a website yet.
Right. But you have a podcast, which is very cool. But things like that are in the works. I'll just say that.
Yeah.
My Dylan book that's my first book, is out of print. Okay. But you can find it. It is, it's available on sites that have used books. I think even Amazon has it. It's mostly a sort of a coffee table book with a lot of photographs in it. It's not any sort of definitive text on Dylan. The Let It Be book is widely available in bookstores, through Amazon. You can get audiobook version of it. I believe there's a Kindle version of it. It is available for those of you who speak either Italian or Japanese. It is available in those languages. I don't speak either one of those languages. It is, some of it has been anthologized in a book. I have written things that have appeared in other books, including Ken Womack's book that he edited that came out last year. I have a segment in there all about the Beatles Let It Be rooftop concert. I believe that's what I wrote about. It's a little hazy.
That's
now.
the Beatles in context, right?
Yes. I know Ken came to me and asked me if I would contribute to that. I was honored. Ken is one of my favorite people who writes about the Beatles, along with people like Bruce Spicer, who I've heard on your show. I heard the interview with Bruce.
As Ken would say, Ken's good people. Right.
Exactly. Mark Lewison, who I know and I've interviewed. I wrote about Tune In on 2 occasions. I interviewed him when the expanded edition was finally published in the United States. I did an extended interview with him, a Q&A over email. But I've interviewed him many times. So, hats off to him and Roy Harper. I love being part of this little club of people who write about the Beatles. I don't consider myself a scholar like some of these folks. Their knowledge is extraordinary. There is another book on the Let It Be sessions by Doug Sulpy. I mean, Doug is the guy who really owns this space. He has written about Let It Be to an extent that is extraordinary. I don't think I could have written my book, without the stuff that he's done. So I don't know if you're aware of Doug, but I highly recommend his books. There's so many great books on the Beatles, and some people say, "Oh, another book on the Beatles? Do we really need another book on the Beatles?" And it's like, yes, I hope they keep coming. The books on the BBC are great books. The Kevin Howlett books on the BBC recordings, beautiful book. The regular commercial edition that's in print, because his original edition, I believe, is out of print. Great stuff. The Barry Miles books are really great too. I really like his books. I'm a big fan of diary and chronology and recording books. I really like those books a lot. There was a John C. Wynne. Am I saying his name correctly?
Sure.
His books. Those books are amazing. I love those. I love those books. I love all the books that are about specifically about Hamburg, or specifically about Liverpool, where they really get into the nitty gritty, those books. I love all these sort of discography books. I could just do nothing but read those kinds of books. I love that stuff.
Me too. But anyways, Steve, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you. This has been great. I enjoy talking about the Beatles. I love your podcast. It's very informative, but lively and fun.
Well, thank you. I'll use that as a tagline.
Go right ahead.
Informative, but lively and fun.
Yes, including including the ringing telephone that should never have happened.
Oh, you know what? The ringing telephone added a quality.
Okay.
But to everyone else out there, thank you for listening. You can go home now.
Bands on the Run is produced by Ethan Alexanian. Additional voiceovers by Richard Phillip. This has been a Showtown production.